everyone, and welcome to Public Health History. In 1751, Mr. B. Dickinson of Ludgate Hill, London, published a pamphlet decrying the evils of the fiery dragon gin, warning of the wretched and deplorable condition of its admirers and votaries, the dreadful havoc and devastation it has made among the human species, its pernicious effects on the soldiers, sailors and mechanics of this kingdom, and its poisonous and pestilent qualities in destroying the health and corrupting the morals of the people. Dickinson was responding to the English artist William Hogarth's depiction of the social and economic consequences of the gin craze in London, which had led to a tide of drunkenness. In some areas, around a quarter of all dwellings and businesses were reported to be distilling or trading in gin. Dickinson went on to declare that the devil himself never invented a more effectual method of peopling his kingdom than by debauching and infatuating the human species with the love of this infernal combustible gin. The gin craze was increasing crime, disrupting production, and, according to some, threatening the security of Britain's growing empire. In 1751, the artist William Hogarth issued 2 engravings, priced at the low rate of £1 each, on the dangers of gin consumption in London. Whether or not he intended it this way, Hogarth's engravings have since become widely known as an early form of health communication, warning of the moral, economic and health hazards of gin consumption. In this video, we'll have a look at these engravings and consider their effectiveness in achieving the goal of reducing gin consumption, ending a bane known at the time as Mother's Ruin. In the first of the 2 engravings, we see Gin Lane, which is a rough depiction of the London area known as St. Giles. It shows an image of social and moral decay, with dilapidated buildings and workers hawking their tools to buy gin. Straight away, you can see the effects on children. A starving child sharing a bone with a dog. The poor, intoxicated woman at the centre of the engraving, dropping her baby in a drunken haze, likely leading to the death of the infant. And over in the right corner, we see a baby being placated with gin by her nursemaid. Outside the distillers, there's a crush of people, and fighting has broken out, with a crutch being used as a weapon. Down the stairs to the Gin Royal, potential drinkers are attracted with the slogan, "Drunk for a penny, dead drunk for 2p, clean straw for nothing." That's for when you passed out. The pamphleteer, in tattered clothes, is clearly dying from starvation, as it looks like no one has purchased his anti-gin leaflet titled The Downfall of Mrs. Gin. And in fact, he seems to have taken up gin drinking himself. Everywhere around, walls are collapsing, poverty is evident, and society is crumbling. From his position on a tower overlooking the carnage, is the devil clearly taking pleasure in his work. Many of the incidents depicted were from court records, newspapers and other documents of the time. William Hogarth was a long-time friend and collaborator of the writer and playwright Henry Fielding. In 1751, the same year that Hogarth released Gin Lane, Fielding penned his own treatise called An Inquiry into the Causes of the Late Increase of Robbers, attributing many of the social ills London was experiencing to gin. Accounts from the time describe children being sedated with gin by nursemaids, who were anxious to get their own gin on. One infamous case from the time concerned a woman who was arrested after she sold her baby's donated clothes for gin, leaving the poor girl in a field while she went drinking, with the infant sadly dying overnight. The intended audience of Hogarth's engraving would have been familiar with many of these cases, which Fielding, as a magistrate, would also have presided over. There's also been a suggestion that the baby depicted here shows an early representation of fetal alcohol syndrome, a condition which was not formally identified until 1973. Fielding asks the question, what must become of the infant who is conceived in gin, with the poisonous distillations of which it is nourished, both in the womb and at the breast? However, Fielding's main concern seems to be about where the next generation of soldiers and sailors for Britain's expanding empire would come from. He feared that many children would not survive to adulthood, while those that did would fill the almshouses and hospitals, infecting the streets with stench and diseases. The counterpoint to Gin Lane was, of course, Beer Street. Here we see workers taking a well-earned break from their labours. As Hogarth himself wrote, The goal was to compare the dreadful consequences of gin drinking with the thriving industry and jollity of beer. The setting for this engraving is the barley mow, with the sign depicting people dancing around a large stack of barley. English barley, of course. The slogan announces health to the barley mow. Almost everywhere you can see thriving industry. The flags show that it is St. George's Day, the King's birthday. Workers toast his health. A crane lifts another barrel of beer high above the street. Fresh fish and vegetables are being delivered, and the poor, emaciated woman being placed in the coffin from Gin Lane has now been replaced by a much healthier woman in a sedan chair. The well-endowed butcher, the blacksmith and paver sit with great flagons of beer around a table with the King's announcement in front of them. The bulging bellies were a clear indicator of health. A smiling woman sits in the arms of the paver, clutching a key that has been interpreted as the key to good health and happiness. A little work, a little play, toil without exhaustion, affection without vulgarity, indulgence without alcoholism. So everything is just peachy, except for the poor pawnbroker who has clearly fallen on hard times. By now, you're probably asking the question, why beer and not water? There were some good health reasons for drinking beer. In polluted urban areas during the Industrial Revolution in England, beer was considered less likely to carry the risk of infection. It was both boiled and fermented. Beer was cheap and relatively nutritious at a time when many people lacked access to healthy food. The alcohol content of beer at the time was also likely to have been much lower, at around 0.75% or 20% of today's brews. However, there's a deeper story behind the gin craze, and we need to look at the social, economic and political factors of the time. The gin craze was a product of war, trade, sanctions, taxes, crushing poverty and market manipulation by the uber-wealthy of the day, washed down with a generous slug of nationalism. You see, gin was considered an imported foreign drink, unlike the more wholesome, locally brewed English beer, described by Hogarth as the happy produce of our isle. The popular version of the story is that gin was brought into England by soldiers returning from the war in Holland. British soldiers, so the story goes, had seen the drunken bravery of the Dutch forces in battle, hence the saying, Dutch courage. There was also a big grain surplus in Britain, with the risk to wealthy landowners of a price collapse. So Parliament made the decision to deal with both. It could both undermine French liquor sales and support local elites by dropping restrictions on distilling. Gin arrived at the perfect time. Pretty much anyone could brew gin, including chandlers, gardeners, butchers and labourers. Consumption of gin in England increased from 527,000 gallons in 1685 to around 2 million gallons in 1714. By 1727, it had grown to 5.4 million gallons and eventually reached 11 million gallons in 1750. That's the equivalent of 2.3 barrels or 30 gallons per capita. Now we come to the bit about crushing poverty. The early 1700s was a period when the poor underclass in London was growing, as land seizures in the countryside were forcing the rural poor off common land. Many of the wealthy elites subscribed to the idea of poverty theory, the idea that poverty was a necessary condition for society. The wealthy were the consumers, while the poor were mere producers. Gin was cheap, cheaper than beer. What better way to escape from your woes than drowning yourself in the juice of the juniper, the devil's right hand? While beer sales remained fairly steady throughout the period, gin was just added on to the top. Over the next 4 or 5 decades, England descended into a moral panic over the explosion of public drunkenness. Parliament periodically passed laws designed to crack down on gin production and to increase prices through the imposition of taxes and licensing fees. However, this had the effect of suppressing more legitimate distillers while promoting more toxic spirits. Poor quality grain, along with additives such as turpentine and sulfuric acid, reportedly making up the difference. Finally, the very imposition of such restrictions resulted in a backlash in the form of popular resistance, particularly in the case of the Gin Act of 1736. The result of these laws, according to a paper by Warner and colleagues, was that the government's attempts to control and regulate gin, rather than reducing consumption, turned the act of drinking it into a form of political resistance. This reaction eventually undermined the laws themselves. So did Hogarth's posters and other warnings work? Well, the evidence for that is fairly weak. Here's an engraving showing the lamentable fall of Mother Gin. That's her, out cold on the platform, while those around celebrate, particularly the beer brewers. Don't get too excited though. This is from 1738, 13 years before Hogarth's Gin Lane, to celebrate the passing of the 1736 laws. The 1736 laws had only a minimal effect on drinking, and enforcement of the laws was weak. Following pressure from industry, these were rescinded in the next decade, and gin surged back. It wasn't until the mid-1750s that things really began to turn around. The grain harvests of 1757 and 1758 were poor, and the distillation of gin was banned to preserve the food supply. By the time the harvest recovered, after a couple of years of relative abstinence, the public mood had shifted. What Hogarth and others depicted were changes in the social aspirations and culture that were underway at the time. Hogarth's Gin Lane depicts a desperate, unproductive underclass compared to a prosperous, productive middle class, thus providing a model that shamed the better class of drinkers by associating them with the image of poverty. This shift in cultural norms coincided with the arrival of alternative higher class drinks, most notably tea, and within a few years the price of tea had fallen below that of gin. So it seems that Hogarth's work, along with other pamphleteers of the time such as Fielding and Dickinson, is more likely to have contributed to changing social values. The public mood had shifted as the consequences for society became widely accepted. By 1758, gin consumption had crashed back to 2 million gallons, falling to 1 million by the end of the century. Hogarth charged a shilling for each print, and 1 6 for a higher quality print, for the curious. As this was well above what the lower class of people could afford to spend their hard-earned on, and definitely not something you would hang on a pub wall, the idea that Hogarth's work appealed to those with money and social aspirations might actually hold up. The gin craze in 18th century England demonstrates how much public health was essential, not just for individual people's health, but the health of the markets, the economy, and society as a whole. We can see that poor public policy contributed to the rise of an intractable public health problem, and it wasn't until there were changes in social attitudes and culture and public policy that we saw its demise. Let's finish with Hogarth's Ode to Beer, penned at the bottom of Beer Street. Beer, happy produce of our isle, can sinewy strength impart, and wearied with fatigue and toil, can cheer each manly heart. Labour and art, upheld by thee, successfully advance. We quaff thy balmy juice with glee, and water leave to France. Genius of health, thy grateful taste rivals the cup of Jove, and warms each English generous breast with liberty and love. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to click the like button and leave a comment below. And look out for the next public health history video in a couple of weeks.